let's go ahead and get started.
Woo-hoo. Awesome. So I'll kind of do the few cleanup items Wendy usually does at the beginning or the end. But for those who have not been to a GPS luncheon before, well, I guess this isn't really a luncheon today, but hopefully you're eating lunch wherever you are. But for those of you who haven't been to a GPS luncheon, Good Policy Society is a nonprofit focused on bringing you experts in various fields to come and talk about policy changes that are happening. We don't invite politicians. We don't have an ask. We don't do anything like that. We just strictly come to inform. And so that's what we're here for today. This is our 6th installment. There are 2 more. They're the second Wednesday of each month, and the last one will be on June 10th until we kick off after the summer, I believe September. Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm coming back in September. So today we have Jason Isaac and David Balat. The topic of today's conversation is healthcare and energy in the age of Corona. And so hopefully you'll bear with us because there might be some kinks. This is the first time we're doing this. So if you have any issues, let us know. But there is a chat function. If you look at your screen on the bottom, it says chat. So if you have a question throughout the course of the conversation and you'd like to ask it, feel free to type it in there. As Annie said, she muted everyone so that we can kind of cancel out any background noise. So feel free to use the chat function. I'll be monitoring it. Annie will as well. And if something pops up that we can work into this discussion, we will. And if not, then we're going to have a Q&A section at the end of the discussion, as we always do, and we'll bring it up then. So just to kind of give you some background about our 2 distinguished guests today, Jason is the Senior Manager and Distinguished Fellow of Life Powered, a project at Texas Public Policy Foundation aimed at raising America's energy IQ. Prior to joining Life Powered, Jason, a 4th-generation Texas native, was elected 4 times as a state representative to Hays and Blanco counties in the Texas Hill Country. He was repeatedly honored for his commitment to limited government and proved to be an effective leader, excelling at both advocating for conservative principles and working across the aisle to find responsible solutions for the future of Texas, which is something that doesn't happen very much today. So thank you for that effort. Jason has appeared on national news shows, and his commentaries have been published in The Hill, The Washington Examiner, The Daily Caller, and other publications. And Jason is a graduate of Stephen F. Austin State University. He's a nonprofit leader and a high school lacrosse coach, and he lives in Hays County with his wife, Carrie, and 2 sons. And David is the director of the Right on Healthcare initiative at the foundation. He's a broad experience across the healthcare spectrum with special expertise in healthcare finance. He's a former congressional candidate in the Texas 2nd Congressional District down here in Houston, and a seasoned hospital executive with more than 20 years of healthcare industry leadership and executive management experience. David's earned the privilege of being invited to testify before the U.S. House Committee on Oversight and Reform in Washington, D.C., and before various House committees in the Texas State Legislature. He is also a published columnist with The Hill, Real Clear Politics, and other news outlets, and an active speaker and commentator on matters of healthcare policy. He speaks at national conferences and advises on healthcare policy to both state and federal lawmakers. And David often volunteers to help families navigate their bills and how to understand their benefits. And he serves as a board member for a nonprofit that's focused on educating legislators and the community about important matters pertaining to healthcare freedom. So, and David is a 1st-generation American and the first in his family to graduate from college. He received his bachelor's from the University of Houston and joint master's in business administration and hospital administration from the University of Houston Clear Lake. Okay, that was a mouthful. So to kick this off, I really want to initiate the discussion by allowing Jason and David to kind of take some time to tell us more about the work that they're currently doing. We gave some background, but we'd love to hear more about the current work you're doing at Life Powered, Jason, and Right on Healthcare, David.
Well, thanks, Charles, so much. Appreciate the introduction. Thanks, Wendy and Annie, for pulling this together for us. Appreciate the opportunity. Sorry we're not in person, and sorry you're not getting to enjoy a nice lunch at Wendy's like the last time I was there. The Life Powered project at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is a project that really makes the connection between access to affordable, reliable energy and human flourishing, and how well we are doing here in the United States because we do have access to affordable, reliable energy compared to developing countries that unfortunately don't. So we try to make that case also about our environmental leadership here in the United States compared to other countries, whether they're developing or not, but we are truly environmental leaders when it comes to environmental protection. This coronavirus has really created a lot of work for us. It's been a lot of weekends pulling things together, especially dealing with the stimulus packages and now dealing with the fourth proposed stimulus package. And you think that Congress is in recess for weeks. There are actually votes that are going to take place this week on Wednesday and Friday. I guess today is Wednesday. Tough when you're working every day and you're working from home to know what day of the week it is. But Congress should be having some votes today and on Friday while they're actually in recess, and most members are not at the Capitol. And so we're working to follow that policy. We know the fourth stimulus is being drafted right now. There was what we refer to as a lot of green bling that was originally put in the third stimulus, if you will. One of those items was calling on airlines to be carbon neutral by 2050, which has absolutely nothing to do with getting Americans back to work and the help that they need in stimulating our economy. There was things in there like investing in or extending or bringing back to life some investment tax credits for wind and solar that recently died or expired. Some of them have been extended 11 times. So a lot of these economic development tools, as they're called, are created by legislatures in states or the federal government. They're supposed to be temporary. And when you see times some of this tax credits regarding wind, 11 times is just appalling. And I'll share with you some interesting a chart here that I like to use pretty often. It talks about the subsidies for wind and renewables, and hopefully that's sharing the right document with you. Do you see a 3-line bar graph, or do you see my entire screen?
We see the document.
Okay, great. Well, good. And that document there shows that wind and solar receive a significant I guess a lot more money than fossil fuels and nuclear do when you break it down into a kilowatt hour of electricity that's produced. And that's really how we should be looking at things. 94 times federal subsidies compared times. It's just a huge advantage for electricity that's not renewable. It's not reliable, and it's certainly not affordable. You would think that with the cost of natural gas decreasing significantly, that electricity costs would be dropping, but they're not, unfortunately. So we're trying to educate people about that. Another thing that I actually have an interview with a guy from Vice News who probably disagrees with me about the climate crisis because he's written books to that effect. I'm actually kind of looking forward to it. I hope I get an opportunity to educate him a little bit. Another chart that I like to use talks about people surviving more over the last 100 years. And this shows the death rate, or really how well we're doing as a society, that climate deaths have decreased, and they've actually gone down 98.9% over the last 100 years since man really started introducing carbon dioxide into the environment. So these are deaths from what we refer to as climate-related deaths. These are floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, extreme temperatures, freezing, and see how much they have gone down.
Jake, is it just me or
Climate?
No, it's not just you.
Okay. Jason, can you hear us? David, why don't you take over until Jason's Wi-Fi kicks back in?
I'd be happy to.
Come on.
Is he there? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for all of you guys that have come on board. Well, I see Jason is back. Jason, would you like to finish?
Oh,
I don't think it may not be working.
He's muted, I think.
Okay. All right. Well, how would you like to handle this, Charles?
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I was just talking a little bit about our survivability of climate-related events over the last 100 years. And there are people that think we're in a catastrophic climate crisis. And if we really are, then we're doing a great job at surviving those weather-related and climate-related events over the last 100 years, again, with deaths decreasing 98.9%. We've been sent letters to members of Congress, over 1,000 staffers, and every member of Congress received a letter from us talking about we should be investing in actually our economy and not what we refer to as, or I refer to as green bling. There was a stimulus in 2009. It had a lot of green energy programs in it, and that program did not peak. Spending did not peak in that program until 2013. So 4 years later, families don't have 4 years to wait to get back to work. There was still spending on that program in 2018. So 9-10 years after the stimulus had been passed in 2009, still seeing spending on these green energy programs. So it's not quick, it's slow and painful, and families just don't have the time to wait. We did send some communication to the president. Oh gosh, I think that was last week as well, talking about our energy recovery and how energy jobs will equal the American recovery. And if we can support infrastructure for energy transportation and exports, specifically in Houston, if we're going to be investing in infrastructure, let's invest that infrastructure in Houston to dredge out the Port of Houston to handle larger ships. So that, as I say, we can export our clean air around the world in the form of our good, dense energy, natural gas, our petroleum products, our natural gas liquids that are used for manufacturing. And let's export that technology around the world. You've also got a port in Philadelphia that would be an incredible opportunity to dredge and expand to handle these larger vessels as well, with so much energy in the northeastern United States. And then also eliminate some regulatory hurdles so that we could build more infrastructure. You see states like New York and California banning pipelines and banning fossil fuels. That's just to the detriment of their state and to their neighbors. And again, we are worldwide leaders in environmental protection, having reduced harmful pollution 74% over the last 50 years. There's an opportunity for us to recover by really export energy. We've got to get rid of these regulatory hurdles that are placed on our refineries. And we still import about 1.5 million barrels per day of foreign oil to be refined. We export some of our oil to be refined overseas and then import the refined products back into the United States. I think if there's one thing that the coronavirus is going to do for us is show us how dependent we are on foreign countries like China. Over 90% of our pharmaceuticals coming from China. You look at the manufactured products, our computers, our cell phones, the technology that we import from China, and the renewable, the quote unquote renewable energy. Over 90% of the materials that go into wind and solar so this is going to help us realize that we need an America first recovery agenda and start producing and manufacturing more of our goods here. The president had already reported a significant uptick in the number of manufacturing jobs that were coming back and the number of manufacturing facilities. We've got to continue that trend and bring those back. There are some other ideas that we submitted to the president, and I'm happy to discuss any of those when we get to our Q&A. But I think it's about my time to pass things off. So Charles, thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. David, you want to go?
Absolutely. And just because Jason brought it up, let me start with this, and then I'll talk about the healthcare center that I have the privilege of getting to serve. The pharmaceuticals, not only does China manufacture 90% of our pharmaceuticals in this country, it's nearly 100% of the active ingredient in our antibiotics. So we absolutely need to bring the manufacturing of the active pharmaceutical ingredients and our pharmaceutical supply back into the United States for a number of reasons. One, for the quality, because there have been a number of products that have come from China that have been shown to be contaminated. We've had to send those back. But not only that, it truly is a national security issue. A good friend of mine wrote a book called China RX, and she goes into the detail of it. But, God forbid we ever get into a war with China, they could very easily weaponize that against us. But the Right on Healthcare initiative of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we fundamentally believe that healthcare is about the doctor-patient relationship. And the reason why healthcare is unaffordable and inaccessible and inefficient is because there are now so many middlemen that come between the two parties in that relationship, government being the largest of them. And so we are looking to see how we can mitigate their existence so that we can make it about doctor and patient. Right now in the state of Texas and at the federal level, we're seeing a huge push for Medicaid expansion. And Texas is definitely in the target there for many, many people. And it's just simply not true that having an insurance card makes us healthier. And that's the argument that we're hearing today. Senator Johnson from Dallas actually has an article in the Dallas Morning News saying that people are healthier, they go to the doctor more, they use the emergency room less. He made a lot of claims, and there are studies that show that every one of them are actually false. The emergency room is used more in expansion states. The health outcomes across the country, based on research that we will be putting out next week, is actually less when in Medicaid expansion states, which means, and let me have you guys listen very closely to what I'm about to say. Based on the research, people on Medicaid and Medicaid expansion states are less healthy than if they had no insurance at all. And that's based on looking at the mortality rate. There are more deaths associated with being on that program. And we go into the great detail of doing that. Brian Blaze, our senior fellow that came out of President Trump's White House, did the research with me on that, and we're looking forward to putting that out. That's going to be a big bombshell of a paper that we will be putting out, and I'm sure that will get a lot of attention. But we want to focus on getting care to people. So we're looking at transparency. We're looking at HSA reform. We're looking at improved telemedicine. In the state of Texas, when we're seeing so many rural hospitals really struggling and shutting their doors, we want to understand why, number one, because we always need to do a needs assessment or some kind of assessment to understand what the problem is. People will say, well, rural hospitals are shutting down because Medicaid managed care is not paying them enough, and therefore we need to increase Medicaid expansion or implement Medicaid expansion. It's not usually that simple. There could be the fact that people are leaving the rural areas for the cities. The outmigration just doesn't justify the existence of that facility. And if that's the case, what do you do then for the remaining population? Because they still need care. Well, there are lots of other solutions. Having a clinic, a federally qualified health center, implementing telemedicine, which would speak to making more robust the broadband for that area. Can the communities contribute towards that? So we want to look to see what are the actual solutions, as opposed to saying, you know what, we just need to put an insurance card in your hand and therefore everything will be better. I will categorically deny that response, and we're again demonstrating to prove that that is false, and that is just purely a political narrative. At the national level, we're focusing on, well, with this, they're calling it 3.5 for Part 4 of the CARES Act. We hear that there will be a vote on whatever that next stimulus package will be by the end of this month. It may be early next month, but we hear the end of this month. So we'll see where that will be. We are looking to do one of two things: help put in good, focused legislation that will help the healthcare system to expand market forces, to focus on getting people care as opposed to insurance. And then we're also pushing back on more regulation. One of the most fascinating things that we have seen in these times is that last count, according to Americans for Tax Reform, was 154 regulations that have been suspended, loosened, or repealed. Why? So that doctors can take care of patients. I would ask this question: were they needed in the first place? Why were they there? If we were so quick to remove them, or to suspend them, or to loosen them, to get doctors to care for patients, why were they there in the first place? So it really speaks to what it is that we've been saying all along. We want to get the middlemen out. We want to get the burdensome regulations out of the way so that those that are trained to practice medicine or nursing or whatever the case may be can do what their expertise gives them the ability to do. And I'll leave it there, Charles, for further questions.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that summary. And I'm glad you brought the regulations, because that's been one of my favorite outcomes. I mean, it sounds horrible, but one of my favorite things to see out of this entire situation is local, state, and federal governments repealing all these regulations and kind of exposing themselves by showing us that they weren't necessary in the first place. Because if they're not necessary during a crisis, then why do we need them when it's not a time of crisis? And so I kind of want to sit on that for a little bit and I guess pose the question to both of you. Jason, do you see a shift? Which way do you see it shifting? Do you see more regulation or less regulation moving forward? And same thing for you, David. I know a lot of states have moved to, like you said, with telehealth. And I know there was something here in Texas where they were kind of readjusting the cost structure for kind of, I think it was over the phone visits as opposed to in-person visits and things like that. So in both industries, where do you see regulation headed moving forward from this? Do you see us leaning more towards deregulation or more regulation?
Well, it's interesting. I think we're going to see more regulations go away, which I think is a great opportunity for us. It's interesting in Texas, and one of my slogans that I have copyrighted is "Make America Like Texas." And it's because we do some things successfully here in our state legislature. When I served in the legislature, we actually balance a budget. But one of the things that we did in 2015 or 17, when I was in, we passed what was called permit by rule. We really took the politicalness, the political process out of businesses applying for permits, that if they met these certain requirements, they got the permit. You didn't have to go through all these hearings and all this, political opportunity for people to grandstand, but it was called permit by rule. I think there's an opportunity within the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Interior, for something very similar to that, to stop this grandstanding and to the slow rolling of energy projects in particular, if we do this permit by rule. So I do think that there is some and I'm an optimist at heart, and I think we've got a great opportunity to roll back some of these regulations. I'll pull it up here in a second when I can switch screens, and I'll look at Americans for Tax Reform have an ongoing list of regulations that have been suspended at the federal level. And another thing I like about the way we do government in Texas, we have a sunset process. I think it could be better, more efficient, but every single agency has a review period, whether it's 6 years, 8 years, 10, 12 years, it's depending on what's passed in the resolution to renew that agency. Some of the fun that I had in the legislature was we actually voted to kill the lottery at one point in time, and I would use Dave Ramsey's quote that says the lottery is for poor people and those that can't do math, or a tax on poor people and those that can't do math. And we actually voted to kill the lottery, I think in my second legislative session, and unfortunately arms got twisted and the vote was reconsidered and it passed. But we do have this process where we look at agencies at the state level of what can we do to improve? What can we streamline? And I really think that the federal government needs to do that as well. And so we'll look at some of these regulations that have been suspended at both the state and federal level and make recommendations to get rid of them. If we don't need them in an emergency, why do we need them in general?
And David, do you see the same on the healthcare side? I think what I'm fearful of is that once the crisis is kind of in our rearview mirror, we're going to go back to business as usual and kind of levy all these regulations and then some. So do you think that's going to be the case, or do you think that we're going to kind of continue this trend?
Well, let me just put it this way. I'm optimistic as well, and we're fighters here at the foundation, so we're going to push for continued deregulation and stopping any bad legislation from moving forward. But my fear is that in this vacuum of regulations that have been removed, you're going to have lawmakers want to fill that vacuum with more rules and more regulations, because that's a way to justify their existence as well. So I would also say on this call, for those of you, if you know your lawmakers, call them up and encourage them in this vein of deregulation, and tell them if you've experienced something positive, tell them the story. They respond to that very, very well, because they can then share that story with other lawmakers, their constituents, and the agencies. A story is a very powerful tool, and that's something that you can be very effective with. But we are here because we believe, it goes back to our mission. When we operate individually and want to have an exchange of goods and services, we tend to do better. And having a relationship with a physician has just gone by the wayside in our current environment. So we want to continue to see that improve and not degrade.
Another thing you both touched upon during your openings was the kind of over-reliance on overseas manufacturing. I guess this is kind of looking into your crystal balls. Do you see this continuing as well? I mean, or is because they do it because the price is good, right? I mean, I guess it's a cheaper price, it's more cost effective for them. But is this a big enough global issue to force change and to kind of expose the over-reliance on overseas manufacturing and then try to claw that back? Do you think have you been hearing this from lawmakers or talking to folks and having people recognize this as a problem?
Only recently have we started to hear it more from our lawmakers at the federal level, for a number of reasons. The quality of the goods and services, especially in the healthcare space, has not been good. The N95 masks, that you're getting them for 2 cents from China, where you could get them for 10 cents in the US. So, or 5 cents, I can't remember. It was a factor, it was 10 cents. So, but the quality is not good for 2 cent masks. So you're getting your money's worth, essentially. You get what you pay for. So people are seeing that there are these failure rates, and even these medications, the toxicity of some of these pharmaceuticals that we have is above what we would accept. And there was a story here recently about one that there was a huge recall on. We can't afford that, because look, we don't want people to, you're taking medication because you have an underlying medical condition. You don't want the thing that's supposed to help you do you more harm. So it's always better, because there's more pride when it's made in America. And that's consistent with what the president has been doing in bringing manufacturing back to the country. I think, will it occur? Will there be more of it? It really depends, I think, on the election in November as to whether that's the case. But the hope is there that it will be, not only for quality, not only for the consistency of the product, but as I mentioned earlier, as a national security concern.
I'll add to that. I had the opportunity to go to Puerto Rico in 2016 to witness an election. And I was a guest of the government there to be an observer and observe their election process to ensure that it was a fair and free election, just on a ballot initiative. It wasn't no one voting for people, but just a ballot initiative in dealing with statehood, and had an opportunity to tour the island and learn about their economy and how things were going, and learned that a tax law that was changed in 2006 led to manufacturing facilities that were in Puerto Rico moving out of Puerto Rico and going overseas, because the cost of business became too high to do things in Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States. Also learned about where they get their energy from, and where they get goods from, and why they pay more for groceries and they pay more for energy in Puerto Rico. And it's because they can't import propane to use for electric generation. They can't import liquefied natural gas from the United States because of the Jones Act. So I started writing about the Jones Act, which is the Merchant Marine Act, I think of 1920, maybe 1923, but basically said, if you're going to export goods from the United States to the United States, it has to be on an American flagged vessel with an American crew, that with a vessel that was built in the United States. Well, there's not a single liquefied natural gas vessel that's built in the United States to transport LNG. So in Massachusetts, they have an import terminal where they import natural gas. And in 2017, there's actually a shipment of liquefied natural gas from Russia that landed and docked in Massachusetts. When we're sitting on so much natural gas here in Texas, not to mention Pennsylvania, which is much closer to Massachusetts, So at that point in time, I started calling for a suspension of the Jones Act, one of these regulations that we could roll back for a temporary, let's say for 5 years. Let's suspend the Jones Act, give shipbuilders an opportunity to see the market, and then start to build these ships here in the United States. That's something I've pushed within the administration and members of Congress. It was actually on a conversation that the Department of Energy hosted yesterday with Congressman Chip Roy and Mike Conaway. So I hope there's some opportunities when you talk about specific regulations that'll truly not only help Americans, but help our energy industry at the same time. I look forward to that. And there's a reasons why things are cheaper in China than they are in the United States. And one of the reasons is labor cost. But another one is environment. I had a meeting with most members of Congress last summer, and I said of all the technology the Chinese steal from us, it'd be nice if they'd utilize our pollution control technology, but they don't. And that actually costs more money. I'd rather those goods be made here in the United States, even if we have to pay a little bit more for them, because it's going to be this circle of life, putting the money right back into our economy, using our electricity, using our environmental protection, and creating American jobs.
Awesome. You talked a bit about, excuse me, the green bling in the stimulus package, and then you also talked about urging the president to do, to push for dredging in the ship channel to encourage increase traffic and things like that. Built in these stimulus packages and through all this federal movement going on right now, which side do you see winning out more so? And when it comes to these funding, I mean, are the green folks, are they being successful in their endeavors, pushing for more, subsidies to green energy and things like that? And I guess the same thing for David. Which way do you see it going in terms of subsidies and assistance going to healthcare built into these stimulus packages? Do you think it's moving in the right direction?
I'll say on the green bling side of things, in the last stimulus, they did not get anything. They did not win, and that was a huge victory for us. I think on the fourth stimulus, we're going to have to go on the offensive and start really talking about investing in infrastructure and start to educate people, which is really what the Life Powered Project does. Is our short mission statement is to raise America's energy IQ. When you look at the numbers, and it's interesting because the EPA in 2009 named CO2 a pollutant. So every single living being is polluting the environment right now because we exhale CO2. I joke that, hey, quit telling me that you want to get all the CO2 out of the environment while you're sitting there drinking your Topo Chico, because you're actually ingesting higher concentrations of CO2 that are in the environment, and it's not killing you. CO2 is actually an abundant, is really necessary for life on Earth. And as we've seen from some groups like Extinction Rebellion that want to keep fossil fuels in the ground, they're actually praising the coronavirus because of the lives it's taking. And they're making it very clear that they want an Earth without humans on it. And we want environmental policy that serves mankind and not the other way around. So I think you're going to get some people that are going to continue to scream and cry wolf about this catastrophic climate crisis, but they're going to realize that, wait, we're actually doing better. We're more resilient. When you've got people in developing countries, women in particular spend 200 million hours a day walking to collect water because they don't have access to energy. And then when you see the models that the UN uses, that what happens if we do eliminate all carbon emissions, it's 0.0017 degrees effect on the temperature by 2050. I mean, it's an absolute minuscule number if you eliminate all carbon dioxide emissions from the United States, but it does increase our cost significantly, 5 times the cost for electricity. We're getting a taste of the Green New Deal right now. We're not driving, we're not leaving our homes, and that's what's going to happen if the Green New Deal becomes laws, because we won't be able to afford to. You're going to see massive unemployment. It's going to be catastrophic, and it will be for no environmental gain whatsoever, but a significant cost to humans.
And David, same question to you. In these stimulus packages and other federal movement, do you see funding and support going to the right areas? I mean, off the top of my head, if I had to just pick one, maybe support for increased telehealth connectivity for rural communities or things like that. Do you see the funding and support going in the right direction, or is it kind of like a knockdown, drag out fight like it sounds like on the other side?
It's yes and no. They're headed in the right direction, but then they just can't help themselves. They're going to wrap up some kind of regulation. So, for telemedicine, just to follow your comment, they're saying, yes, you can use telemedicine. Yes, we'll pay, but we're going to establish pay parity for telemedicine equal to what it would be in an office. Well, that's not necessary. People can do it faster, cheaper, and it can be less expensive to Medicare, Medicaid, or the insurers by the doctor not having to use their overhead. So the other thing that it's doing, it's also a bad way of it's a bad design is, I guess, what I'm trying to get to, especially with the hospitals. You know, the president, and I appreciate the thought in this. They said, look, rather than giving this to the stimulus money to insurance companies, we want to give it directly to the hospitals, and we're going to cover all of the COVID testing. And then many of the states have worked with the insurers to say, we want all insurance to pay 100% for anything COVID related. Well, then the CDC came out a couple of weeks ago and basically said that there are two codes associated with COVID. COVID tested positive and suspected rule out COVID. And then Dr. Birx with the team at the White House came out just Monday and basically she outright said in a press conference, we are very liberal in our stance in this country, and that if you come in for something else, say you come in with a heart attack and you pass due to a heart attack, but you're also COVID positive, it will be listed as a COVID death. So my concern that the motivation by a lot of hospitals, because they are getting paid in full, that there's a perverse incentive to code more liberally.
Okay.
So it's you know, you've got the angel and the devil associated with how they've designed these things.
Right. So, you know, bringing it back to Texas and the Texas legislature, when you and I spoke, you said that this next session was kind of going to be the healthcare session. And so do you think that's still the case? And if so, have the objectives changed going into this? And I guess to Jason, you know, obviously you were a state representative, you're very involved in public policy, deeply involved in public policy. What are your thoughts on the Texas budget, the rainy day fund, which is, you know, largely funded by oil and gas taxes? You know, what are your thoughts on going into this next session as well? David, you can take it first if you want.
Oh, yeah, thank you. It has changed. It has changed. So with what's happened to oil and gas, the budget will be bleak. And so there's been a bigger push now because the federal government has said, well, we will fund Medicaid outright. And so many folks who have said in the past, this is caring for our fellow neighbor. This is, we want to help people that are uninsured and that are poor. They've changed their argument. Now they're saying this will help with the Texas budget. This will help with our budget going forward in the future. And we can't just leave this money out there. We've got to take it. So it's become a financial argument, which I'm actually more thankful. It's you know, that table has turned. That's always been an argument against conservatives, that we're always talking about money and that we couldn't afford it, where they were talking about care, and now the tables have turned. So we're talking about the fact that it's about care, and it should always have been about care, but our perspective is the one that is more compassionate, I believe. So that's going to be the biggest fight.
I'll tell you, on the budget side, my first legislative session in 2011, we faced a $27.5 billion budget shortfall. I think the projections now are going to be somewhere between $10 and $20 billion with a shortfall, which is a smaller percentage of the budget because the budget has grown so much over the last 10 years. But I was excited to be part of a legislature that for the first time in 50 years had actually reduced spending. Unfortunately, there was a lot of gimmicks that were done to get there. We cut about $17 billion in spending and still managed to balance the budget. That was when I first learned that we've done this before is not always a good term and not always a good idea. When someone says, oh, don't worry, we've done this before, that should raise the hair on the back of your neck and maybe some concerns, because there was a lot of that. And we pushed payments off that were due at the end of August to September 1st. So they fell in the next budget cycle as a way to kind of alleviate some of the cuts that we had to make. But I do think it gives us a good opportunity to cut some regulations. I'm most optimistic about some of these economic development incentives for wind and solar, where they get property tax abatements and exemptions if they agree to create so many jobs. And I'm all for creating jobs, but in an urban area, if you have an economic development incentive where you get a tax exemption or an abatement for 10 years, you're supposed to create 25 jobs. In a rural area, it's 10 jobs. And a vast majority, over 90% of these abatements, these exemptions, these property tax exemptions for wind and solar create 1.5 jobs. But they get this waiver from the local taxing entity. And what happens when you see a property tax exemption or abatement, what that does is that increases the burden on those of us that are paying. So when you start to take land in a county or in a school district or an emergency services district off of the tax roll, again, the people that are in that area are going to start picking up more of the burden. And unfortunately, those particular exemptions drive up the cost of electricity. They're not reliable. And so I'm optimistic that people aren't going to be wanting to leave that money on the table. Like, hey, if someone's got a wind, they want to put wind in, they're already going to get a federal tax subsidy. Why give them a state one as well? So I think we're going to be able to eliminate some of those subsidies to help alleviate maybe some of the financial hardships for school districts and emergency services districts.
Okay. So since we're coming down to, well, not last 17 minutes, we're going to open up the Q&A. I got one question here, and it's actually directed to David, but it then made me think of something to ask you, Jason, as well. So we're going to take everybody off of mute, and if you guys do have a question, feel free to, once they wrap up the answer to this one, kind of shout it out, and we'll try to heard this and make sure it goes correctly. But the question is, to David, how do you push back against the argument that people like Bernie Sanders make that healthcare is a right? What do you say to that? And then Jason, that made me think of another argument that I often hear. Here in Houston, you have a lot of communities that live in and around the port area and the energy, well, not so much energy corridor, but near some of the plants. And they argue that they're oppressed because of the energy industry, and no one's listening to their concerns and things like that. And so they're pushing for green energy as a solution to that. And you made an interesting point during your first presentation I saw you at GPS, which was that oil and gas decreases the cost for pretty much everything we use in life. And so really, if you're talking about helping low-income folks, that would be the answer. So if you both can touch upon that, David, to the healthcare as a right, I'd love to hear the answer to that.
That's one of my favorite questions. Beware of any right that the government gives you, because they will surely take it away. Someone who says that healthcare is a right, or that this is a right, or that is a right, is someone who's never read the Declaration. Our rights come from God, not from government. And they're trying to change the argument to where it is something that government gives you. Government is going to be your caretaker. Your rights can't compel the work of another. And that's what healthcare is. It's the work of people who have trained. So that's problematic. The other thing that I always do say to folks that say it's a right is, look, let's just assume right now that it is. No right. There's nothing that guarantees that the government will pay for rights. Otherwise, I have a list of guns that I'd like to have purchased. Where do I send the invoice for the government to pay for that bill? Because there's nothing that says that the government must pay for our rights. So, and that's what they're implying when they say those things. But it's certainly not a right. And it's not a privilege either. Healthcare is a service. And we also have the right to maintain and manage our own health. I think it's important, and I think I may have said this, I know I probably said this at a number of other events. When you hear a politician say the word healthcare, I want that to trigger something in your mind. I want you to understand that they're not talking about healthcare. They're talking about health insurance. So they're not talking about healthcare being a right. They're talking about health insurance being a right. And we know that that's just not right or correct. But the only thing that we have a right to is our life, our health. And that's something that we can control and we should work to improve on a daily basis. Healthcare is a relationship between us and a medical professional. And health insurance is the way that we pay for it when it becomes something catastrophic. So those are a variety of things that I would say to someone who comes to me with that statement.
I always loved it to play on that healthcare message. I always loved it when people in the media would say, you know, Jason, Texas has the highest rate of uninsured people in the nation. And I would always say we have the highest rate of people that are accepting personal responsibility. And that's the kind of the way I look at it. And again, I'm an optimist. And one of the things we preach at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is personal responsibility. To talk about your question about the people that live in the ports and how they feel that they're oppressed, we've done incredible work on our air quality here in the United States and actually removing harmful pollution from the air. We're #1 in the world when it comes to access to safe and clean drinking water. Just 40 years ago, I think it was less than 10%. No, I'm sorry, it was right at 40% of our public water systems met the lowest standards. The lowest standards. Today, over 90% of our municipal water systems meet the highest standards. And you treat water with access to energy. I love it when people talk about habitat. One of the biggest threats to species is the loss of habitat. And when you look at the amount of land that's required to produce equivalent amount of energy, for solar, it's 27 times the amount of land is required to produce the same amount from a traditional fossil fuel, coal, fire, natural gas, or nuclear plant. 27 times the amount of land. For wind, it's over 100 times the amount of land. We did a study last year at the request of Senator Cornyn about what the cost of the Green New Deal would mean to Texas. Well, Texas would require 6.2 million acres of land for wind, solar, and transmission lines. That's, I think it's 5 or 6 times the size of Harris County would need to be covered in wind and solar and transmission lines in the state of Texas to go 100% renewable. That's assuming you have enough battery storage. And just to give you an idea on battery storage, if anyone ever tells you, oh, we'll just use batteries, the battery storage that's installed on Earth today isn't enough to keep the lights on in New York City for 45 minutes. That's what's installed on Earth today. Every form of energy has some environmental impact. We choose the one that's preferably it's more dense and has less of an environmental impact, and that's our fossil fuels. It's our fuels that are right under our feet that are helping us become a world leader in environmental quality and environmental protection. So those jobs that are there along the port, we should be grateful for that we're refining and producing this energy right here in the United States. And I hope to see more refineries and more production of our energy here in Texas and the US.
I got another one sent in Messenger to me. It says there have been renewed calls for Medicaid expansion as the outbreak has grown. David, what do you think about that? I think you touched upon that before. You said you have a report coming out next week, was it, that looked at this?
We have research that shows that the states that have expanded Medicaid actually have a higher mortality rate. We're seeing more people pass, and you'll see in the research that much of that has to do with the opioid epidemic. It is rampant in Medicaid expansion states and in Medicaid. So it's very problematic. It's not being controlled. It's not managed well. And there was also another study in Oregon. It's the Oregon Medicaid Project, and their outcome. And again, Oregon expanded Medicaid. This was a great study because it was very non-political. They just laid out all the facts, and their outcome was the expansion of Medicaid was the equivalent of folks not having insurance at all. So we want to focus on fixing Medicaid. We want to focus on doing right for the vulnerable of Texas that need it. And so the advocates for expanding Medicaid are focusing on pet projects, bringing more money in via the federal government, and just purporting a left wing political narrative so that they can have a success. And again, that's not caring about the people that actually need it. Medicaid is for what? The disabled, women, children, and the elderly. They already are not getting the care that they need. We have over 500,000 people in the state of Texas alone that are eligible for Medicaid but are not enrolled. And why is that? It's because we don't have enough physicians that are enrolled providers in the program. Because in working with many of them in my hospitals when I was an administrator, it wasn't the patients. People will say, well, they don't like dealing with those patients. That's absolutely not the case. It's because of the administrative bureaucracy and burden associated with dealing with the Medicaid program and the Medicaid managed care organization. So I will again and again and again hold my feet to firm when it comes to talking about caring for the vulnerable of Texas as opposed to letting all these able-bodied adults in there. Because in addition to the 500,000 people that are eligible that are not enrolled, they're looking to put on another 1.5 million able-bodied adults that could have some other form of coverage. And right now, if you're uninsured, you have access to 80% of the healthcare that somebody who has insurance does, and that's typically free of charge. I'll just go on to say this one thing. We wrote an article in Honest Austin. I did a collaborative with Andrew Brown, with the director for children and families. And there was a push saying, well, the homeless of Austin don't have health care, and therefore we need to expand Medicaid. We found that in the city of Austin, there were over 40 federally qualified health centers that take anybody who walks in and will take care of them free of charge, because there have been programs in place for decades. And it's behavioral health, it's dental, it's medical, you name it, and they can take care of whatever it is that you may need or would be helpful to you or your family. But people aren't focused on health insurance and coverage.
There'll be immense pressure on the legislature next session to expand Medicaid. It was one of the things that I was proud that we fought. And quite honestly, there were Republicans that were trying to sneak it in the legislature during my 4 terms, and we were successful in fighting it off. And if you don't know, you get 100% of the federal money for the first few years, and then after that, it drops down to 90%, but the state has to continue to pay at that 100% level. So your spending is going to increase. Your government's going to grow. So hopefully by the start of next legislative session, the Texas Public Policy Foundation will have been successful in killing the Affordable Care Act, because we're hamstrung. The legislature's hamstrung on actually making cuts to other welfare programs, because in 2007 and 2009, some of the programs were expanded to say that, well, if you're 3 times the poverty level, you qualify for these programs. When the Affordable Care Act was passed, it said you can't roll those back. You can't go to 2.5 times. You can't go to 2 times the federal poverty limit. And that was one of the most telling conversations that I had with our Health and Human Services office when I was in office. They talked about all these people that they were serving and how many people they were helping and how many people they were convicting of fraud, waste, and abuse. And I asked them, what are you doing to get people off of these programs? And they had no answer.
That's telling.
Well, and speaking of fraud and abuse, let me just tell you real quickly about what happened in Louisiana. There was an auto enrollment because they're a Medicaid expansion state. And when they were pushed into doing an audit, 8 out of 10 were ineligible for Medicaid. There was such rampant misuse of that program and outright fraud.
Well, these are cautionary tales when this fight comes in Texas, that's for sure. All right, well, now it's 12:56, so we're trying to get out of here 1. So I appreciate you guys for taking the time to do this. Maybe if you want to kind of give a little bit of a wrap-up statement and tell folks where to find you guys and what work you guys may have coming out soon that they can check out, or whatever you want to tell them, feel free.
I did post in the chat, which I think the chat will end as soon as this call's over. So the list of 154 regulations that have been waived on the Americans for Tax Reform website. So that link is on there. Grab that. Now it's time to do it. And you can find me here if my fingers are right, and here. lifepower.org, and there's my Twitter handle and our Twitter handle as well. So check us out, interact with us.
Awesome.
Wonderful. I don't have anything here,
Yeah.
but
I'll make one for you.
thank you. You can find me on Twitter at David Balot HC for healthcare. And we've just rolled out our newsletter for Right on Healthcare. If you go to texaspolicy.com/ROH for Right on Healthcare, ROH, there's an opportunity for you to sign up, and you'll be getting something in your mailbox twice a month. And we try to make it as healthcare is complex, and we get that it's complicated. So we try to make it as easy to understand as possible, so that there's something actionable for you to take to your lawmakers when you call or email them, or in some cases when you all text them.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Jason and David. Thank you, everybody else who participated in the call. Appreciate you guys being patient while we ironed out the details for our first Zoom meeting. So I don't know how this is going to go, but we might be having another one of these next month, depending on what happens. So stay tuned. If you're not signed up for the GPS newsletter, you can go on to goodpolicysociety.com and sign up for that, and you can become a member. You can invite guests. You can prepare for our next series of sessions starting in September, but make sure you sign up so that you can get the information about our May and June events that are coming up. So thank you all again. I appreciate everybody taking the time to do this, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.